The paper in Alara's hand trembled, a tiny rhythmic betrayal. 12 names, 12 dates of death, 12 identical causes listed in the hospital's records. Natural causes, cardiac failure, old age finally winning its long war. But Alara knew better. Her own notes, scrawled on the back in frantic, jagged script, told a different story. Agnes Richter, room 304, smelled like almonds. Thomas was there. George Bell, room 312, cool to the touch an hour before. Thomas held his hand. The list was a death sentence, maybe her own. For 6 months, a quiet dread had been growing in the marrow of her bones, a cold spot on the sterile, brightly lit third floor of St. Jude's long-term care wing. She was a night nurse. Her world was one of soft beeps, the gentle hiss of oxygen, the rustle of sheets, and the slow, steady rhythm of sleeping and waking, and, inevitably, of dying. It was a place of endings. But these endings felt wrong. It started with Agnes Richter, a formidable woman who, even at 84, would argue about the sugar content in her Jell-O. One night, Alara found her uncharacteristically placid. "I'm just so tired, dear," Agnes had whispered, her sharp eyes cloudy. "So very tired." An hour later, her heart monitor flatlined. Dr. Evans, overworked and perpetually weary, had signed the chart without a second glance. She was 84, Alara. It was her time. 2 weeks later, it was George Bell, the retired postal worker who told the same 3 jokes every night, the same placid fatigue, the same phrase. Just feeling tired. Then silence. Again, natural causes. A pattern began to emerge, a ghostly imprint visible only to her. Patients who were stable, even improving, would suddenly decline. It was always peaceful. Too peaceful. There was no struggle, no final rally, just a gentle fade, like a candle flame being softly cupped by an unseen hand. The other nurses were relieved. "It's a blessing, really," one had said, "to go so quietly." But Alara saw the lie in the quiet. She started a small secret log in a spiral notebook she kept in the bottom of her locker. Dates, times, names, and one other constant. Thomas. Thomas was the night orderly everyone loved. He was young, soft-spoken, with kind eyes and a gentle touch. He'd bring flowers for the nurse's station, bought with his own money. He'd sit with the loneliest patients, reading to them for hours, his voice a soothing baritone. He was patient and compassionate, an angel in blue scrubs. But Alara noticed he was always the last person to be with them. He was the one who heard their final words. He was the one who would find them, his face a perfect mask of sorrow, and say, "They're gone. They just slipped away." She once entered a room moments after he'd left. A faint, cloyingly sweet smell hung in the air, something like bitter almonds. It vanished in seconds, lost in the ever-present scent of antiseptic. She noted it down. She started watching him, her observations becoming a tight knot of terror in her stomach. She saw him adjust a patient's IV line, a tiny, almost imperceptible squeeze of the tube just above the drip chamber. He'd hold her hand, his thumb stroking their wrist, right over the pulse point. He'd lean in close, whispering things she couldn't hear. She took her suspicions to her supervisor, a woman buried in paperwork and hospital politics. She was listened to with a patient, condescending smile. "Alara, Thomas is our best orderly. Are you suggesting what exactly? That our model employee is harming patients? Do you have any proof?" Proof? All she had was a notebook full of terrifying coincidences and the memory of a scent. It wasn't enough. It was career suicide. She was a nurse, not a detective. They would call her hysterical, unstable. She would be fired and the quiet dying would continue. The final straw was Mr. Henderson, a retired watchmaker with hands so gnarled by arthritis he could no longer hold his tools, but whose mind was as precise as a Swiss movement. He was frail, but he was a fighter. That night, she saw Thomas in his room, holding his hand. She heard the familiar, chilling murmur. "It's all right, Mr. Henderson. It's okay to rest now. You must be so tired." A cold dread washed over her. It was happening again. Mr. Henderson was next. And Alara knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he had 2 nights left at most. Desperation is a key that unlocks strange doors. As she stood in the pre-dawn quiet of the locker room, The list of 12 names clutched in her hand. A memory surfaced. Agnes Richter's funeral. The pews filled with family and friends, and in the back, a phalanx of men who did not fit. They wore leather vests over black shirts, their arms thick with tattoos, their faces grim. They were the Iron Angels Motorcycle Club, and at their center stood a mountain of a man, his long hair tied back, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes hollowed out with a grief so vast it seemed to suck the air from the room. He hadn't cried. He had simply stood there, a monument of silent, shattered strength. That was her son. Everyone in town knew him. They called him Bear. The thought was insane. Walking into that world, with this story, they would laugh at her, or worse. But what other choice did she have? The police wouldn't listen. The hospital wouldn't listen. But a son who had lost his mother? Maybe he would. Have you ever been so sure of something, so certain in your gut, that you were willing to risk everything, even when everyone else told you that you were wrong? It's a lonely place to be. If you've ever trusted that feeling, let us know in the comments. And if this story resonates with you, consider liking and subscribing, because courage often begins with one person who refuses to look away. The address for the Iron Angels clubhouse wasn't public, but in a small town, secrets have a short shelf life. A quick, hushed question to a hospital security guard who owed her a favor was all it took. The building was an old windowless warehouse on the industrial edge of town, painted flat black. A crudely painted sign of a winged skull hung over the steel door. Parking her beat-up sedan a block away, Lara felt like a ghost. Her nurse's uniform, usually a cloak of competence, felt flimsy and absurd here. Every step toward the door was a battle against the screaming instinct to turn and run. The air smelled of diesel, old asphalt, and something vaguely like charred meat from a nearby diner. She could hear the low thrum of rock music from inside. She raised a trembling hand and knocked. The music stopped. The sudden silence was more intimidating than the noise. A small slot in the door slid open, and a pair of suspicious eyes peered out. "We're closed." The voice was gravelly. I need to see Bear," Ilara stammered, her own voice a thin, reedy thing. "Who's asking?" "My name is Ilara. I was Agnes Richter's nurse." The eyes narrowed. The slot slammed shut. For a long moment, nothing happened. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She was about to turn away when the heavy door groaned open. A man built like a refrigerator blocked the entrance. He jerked his head, a silent command to enter. The inside was dark and smoky. The smell of stale beer, leather, and sweat hung heavy in the air. A dozen men were scattered around tables, their conversations cut short. They all turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. It was like walking into a wolf's den. They weren't just bikers. They were a wall of silent judgment. At the back of the room, sitting alone at a heavy wooden table, was Bear. He was even larger up close, a man who seemed to have his own gravitational pull. He didn't look up. He was slowly polishing a piece of chrome with a soft cloth, his movements deliberate and focused. Ilara walked toward him, each footstep echoing in the cavernous space. The other men watched her, unblinking. She felt like an antelope approaching a lion. She stopped at his table. He still didn't look up. "They said you were her nurse," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she managed. "She liked you, said you didn't treat her like she was made of glass." He finally lifted his head and his eyes pinned her to the spot. They weren't angry or sad. They were just empty, a flat gray emptiness that was more terrifying than any rage. "What do you want?" Her throat was dry. Words failed her. She reached into her purse, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the folded paper. She pulled it out and laid it on the table between them. She pushed it across the polished wood. The paper slid, millimeter by millimeter, a white flag in a sea of black. He stared at the paper, then back at her. "What is this?" "It's a list," she whispered. "Your mother's name is at the top. There are 11 others. They all died the same way, in the same hospital wing, on the same shift." Bear's eyes dropped to the paper. His big, calloused fingers, surprisingly gentle, unfolded it. He read the first name, Agnes Richter. His jaw tightened, a flicker of muscle under his thick beard. He read the next name, and the next. The silence in the room deepened. becoming heavy and suffocating. He read the whole list, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly refolded the paper, his movements precise, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his leather vest. He looked at her again, and for the first time, the emptiness in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, terrifying intelligence. "Tell me everything." And so she did. Leaning forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, she told him about the peaceful deaths, the phrase "just so tired," the faint smell of almonds, the kind-faced orderly named Thomas, and her fears for Mr. Henderson. She spoke for 10 minutes, laying out the whole impossible, horrifying story. The bikers around them didn't move, their focus entirely on her and their leader. When she finished, the room was utterly still. Bear stared at a spot on the table, his gaze distant. He seemed to be weighing her words, sifting them for truth. He could have dismissed her as a lunatic. He could have thrown her out. Instead, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He pulled out his phone. He didn't dial. He sent a text, a single word. "Observe." Then he looked up at Alara, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "Go home. Go to work tomorrow. Act like nothing has happened. Don't talk to anyone about this. Not a soul. Do you understand?" "Yes," she breathed. "We'll handle it." It wasn't a promise of violence. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the cold certainty of a surgeon. A wave of relief so potent it made her dizzy washed over Alara. She had handed the bomb to someone else, someone strong enough to carry it. As she walked out of the clubhouse, no one stopped her. The heavy door closed behind her and the rock music started again, but it sounded different now. It sounded like the low growl of a waking beast. The next day, the hospital felt different. Or maybe it was Alara who was different. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but it was overlaid with a strange, new current of anticipation. She went about her duties, her movements calm, her expression neutral. She was an actress playing the part of a night nurse who suspected nothing. She saw Thomas. He smiled his gentle smile. "Rough night, Ilara?" he asked, his voice full of synthetic sympathy. "The usual," she replied, her voice steady. But things were not the same. A new janitor was mopping the floors, a quiet, burly man with a thick neck and intricate tattoos peeking out from under his collar. He never seemed to be in a hurry, his movements slow and methodical, his eyes missing nothing. A woman she'd never seen before was sitting by the bedside of a sleeping patient in the room across from Mr. Henderson's, knitting silently, her gaze periodically drifting down the hall. In the visitors' parking lot, a man sat in a dark pickup truck, just watching the entrance to the staff parking area. They were ghosts, the 188 angels. They had infiltrated the sterile, ordered world of the hospital with unnerving ease. They were mechanics, construction workers, and bar owners. Men used to seeing the world from the edges. They noticed things the doctors and administrators, in their hurried self-importance, missed. That night, Bear received a series of texts from the janitor. Target carries a black metal water bottle. Never drinks from the fountains. Wipes the cap before and after every sip. From the knitter, he adjusted Henderson's IV. A small pinch, less than a second. Didn't look like he did anything. From the man in the truck, Target left a discarded IV bag in the outer bin, separate from the main medical waste. Bagged it, leaving it at the drop point. The drop point was the back of a 24-hour auto body shop. The bag was handed to another angel, a man nicknamed Doc, who had been a combat medic and now ran a surprisingly sophisticated chemistry lab in his garage to customize paint. He ran the residue from the IV bag through a gas chromatograph. An hour later, he called Bear. "It's not potassium chloride," he said, his voice tight. "It's cesium chloride, in a saline solution with a binding agent. Looks almost identical in a basic tox screen, but it acts faster. It disrupts the heart's electrical signals. In a healthy person, it'd cause arrhythmia. In someone frail, it would just look like their heart got tired and gave out. It's clever, cruel but clever, and almost completely untraceable after a few hours." Bear listened, his face a stone mask. The pieces clicked into place. The gentle touch, the whispered words of comfort, the untraceable poison. This wasn't murder for gain or for passion. This was something far more twisted. This was an angel of death who had appointed himself judge and jury. He looked at the calendar. Mr. Henderson had been consoled by Thomas 2 nights ago. If the pattern held, Tonight was the night. Bear sent one final text to Alara. Tonight. Create a distraction at 2 a.m. Code Yellow. Room 309. Be ready. Code Yellow meant a missing patient. It was a controlled chaos, guaranteed to draw staff to one end of the hall. Room 309 was empty, under renovation. It was the perfect lure. The hours leading up to 2 a.m. were the longest of Alara's life. Every beep of a monitor, every footstep in the hall, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She forced herself to go through her rounds to check vitals, to smile at patients. She saw Mr. Henderson. He was asleep, his breathing shallow. The watchmaker's hands lay still on the crisp white sheets. At 1:55 a.m., she saw Thomas walking down the hall, his movements unhurried, his kind smile in place. He carried a small tray with a single glass of water. He nodded at her as he passed. "Just checking on Mr. Henderson," he said softly, "making sure he's comfortable." Alara's heart pounded. He disappeared into room 312. The door clicked softly shut. In the hallway, the janitor leaned his mop against the wall and pulled a walkie-talkie from his belt, pretending it was part of his gear. He spoke one word into it. "In." Outside, two more angels who had been waiting in the stairwell began moving. At precisely 2 a.m., Alara took a deep breath, walked to the nurse's station, and pressed the panic button. "Code Yellow!" she yelled, her voice filled with practiced alarm. "Code Yellow! Patient missing from room 309!" Heads popped out of rooms. Nurses and orderlies began rushing down the hall, their focus entirely on the opposite end of the wing. It was the perfect distraction. In that moment of manufactured chaos, the door to room 312 opened. But it wasn't Thomas coming out. It was the janitor, a big man named Jax, who stepped out and quietly locked the door from the outside with a special key. He stood in front of it, arms crossed, an immovable object. Inside the room, Thomas had been standing over Mr. Henderson's bed. He hadn't brought water. In his hand was a small syringe filled with a clear liquid. He just uncapped the needle when he heard the code yellow alarm. He paused for a second, annoyed at the interruption. As he turned back to the IV port on Mr. Henderson's arm, a hand clamped down on his wrist. A second man who had slipped in behind him as silent as a shadow held his arm in an iron grip. It was another angel, a man they called Preacher, for his unnervingly calm demeanor. Thomas's eyes widened, not in fear, but in surprised indignation. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice low and steady. Preacher didn't answer. He simply applied pressure to Thomas's wrist until the syringe dropped from his numb fingers. A third angel, who had been hiding in the room's private bathroom, stepped out and picked it up, carefully placing it in a plastic evidence bag. Thomas looked from one man to the other. His calm finally broke, but not into panic. It fractured into pure, unadulterated rage. "You have no right," he hissed. "He was suffering. I was giving him peace. It was an act of mercy." He tried to struggle, but it was useless. Preacher held him fast. The quiet click of the door being locked from the outside had sealed his fate. There was no shouting, no violence, just the cold quiet and absolute end of his reign. Mr. Henderson slept through it all. The police arrived 10 minutes later, called by Bear from the parking lot. They found Thomas being held silently in the room, the syringe on the nightstand, and 3 imposing men waiting to give statements. Faced with incontrovertible evidence, Thomas didn't deny it. He confessed, his words a chilling, self-righteous monologue about his divine purpose. His mission to end the suffering of those he deemed had no quality of life left. He listed the 12 names on Alara's list, and more from other hospitals, his voice filled with pride. Alara stood in the break room, the adrenaline leaving her system in crashing waves, leaving her shaking and cold. The door opened and Bear walked in. He looked impossibly large in the small, brightly lit room. He didn't say thank you. The words would have been too small for the moment. He walked over to her and placed a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. The weight was grounding, a solid anchor in the storm that had just passed. "Your family now," he rumbled, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "The angels. We protect our own. You're safe." The simple declaration held more power than any legal document or police protection ever could. It was a promise forged in grief and sealed in justice. The tears she had been holding back for months finally came. not in sobs, but in a silent, steady stream of overwhelming relief. She had spoken up, and someone had listened. 5 years later, Ilara stood on a small stage in a crowded community park. The sign behind her read, "The Agnes Initiative, 4th Annual Patient Advocacy Gala." She was no longer a quiet night nurse. Her voice, once a whisper, was now clear and strong as she spoke into the microphone. She wore a simple black dress, and on the lapel was a small silver pin, a wing and a skull. The initiative, funded almost entirely by the Iron Angels and their network of legitimate businesses, had become a formidable force. They were a watchdog group, a team of investigators, nurses, retired cops, and data analysts who looked for patterns in long-term care facilities. They were the voice for the voiceless, the ones who listened when a family member said, "Something just doesn't feel right." They had already uncovered 2 other cases of systemic abuse and neglect, saving countless lives. In the front row, Mr. Henderson, now 91, sat in his wheelchair, his mind still sharp. He winked at her. And at the edge of the crowd, leaning against an old oak tree, was Bear. He never stood too close at these events, preferring the periphery. But he was always there, a silent, watchful guardian. Their bond had transcended the strange circumstances of its beginning. He was her brother, her protector, her staunchest ally. He had found a purpose for his grief, and she had found her courage. Later that evening, the 188 angels gathered at their clubhouse. Ilara was there, a glass of whiskey in her hand. It was their tradition. Bear raised his glass. "To the 12, he said, his voice a low rumble that filled the room. "To the 12, 187 voices echoed back. "And to the one who saw them," Bear added, his gray eyes finding Ilara's. "To the one who saw," they all repeated. It was a toast to the dead, a tribute to the living, and a promise to the future. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear scrubs and work the night shift. Sometimes they wear leather and ride motorcycles. The most heroic thing a person can do is to pay attention, to trust that small voice inside that whispers when something is wrong, and to have the courage to speak up, even if your voice shakes. What do you think? Have you ever had a moment where your instincts screamed at you? Share your story with our community below. Your voice matters, and if you believe in the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, help us spread this message.